So it's a real pleasure to be here with you sharing, and also to be doing it from my home. So I have two very small children. So we're going to be talking about my book. This is the cover. So that's my daughter, and there's my son. They're older now. They're 4 and 5.5, but it's hard to be, I don't like to be away from them. So it's nice to be able to share with you and still be able to tuck them into bed. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that. So a little bit about me. As Catherine said, I was born in Detroit, Michigan. My family moved to Minneapolis when I was about to start high school. So that's where I went to high school. I went to college in the East Coast. And after college, lived in New York City for a while. Kind of traveled around after that. It landed back in Minneapolis at least part of the time, because what I ended up doing, despite the fact that my degree was in English literature, was becoming a touring musician. So I had this really fun career, just, kind of being semi-homeless and having a lot of adventures, but it was also pretty tiring. And I had gotten to the point where I knew I needed to make a change. So when I came to Perkins County, I taught school here. I was the English teacher, and I really didn't expect that I was going to stay. I thought I was more just coming to have a chance to kind of catch my breath and figure out what was going to happen next. And it's all true. I fell in love with a cowboy, and then the rest is history. But before I fell in love with a cowboy, I fell in love with two lambs. I had made friends with some folks here, and the very first time I went into their barn during lambing season, I have no way to understand it, but it was like, part of me was like, oh, this is what I've been waiting for. I just loved it. I loved the smell of the straw and all the moms and the little babies, and just, it was so cool. And so they our friends run a pretty big operation, and they get a lot of bum lambs every year, which if you don't have a ranching background, is just the name we usually give for babies that need to be bottle fed. And so I was like, well, if you ever need help, I'll help you. I'll take, if you ever have bottle babies that need extra help, I'll take them. And so they ended up giving me two baby lambs. And the idea was that I would give them back or sell them or something, which is what you're supposed to do. But instead, I just decided that they were mine forever. And so then after that, it was like, well, I can never move back to a city now because I have two pet sheep. So I was forced to live forever in a place that would have a pasture. And lucky for me, my husband, who is a cowboy and was not a keeper of sheep, that was part of our courtship, was him deciding he was willing to take on sheep, for which I'm very thankful. He knew how to play his cards right. Similarly, I had this something similar happen. The third graders at the school hatch out their some eggs as a project for the class, and at the end of the first year, they had all the chicks that they'd hatched, and so they were kind of like, oh, who wants them, and I said, I'll take them. So I also had a coop full of chickens that had to come with me too. So that one of my just a very bizarre and hilarious memory is moving day, when I had a Subaru station wagon with a bird cage full of chickens and two lambs in the way back. It was like, well, this was unexpected. So I'm going to just dive right in. The book, so this book that I've written is called Accidental Rancher, which, in light of what I've just described, I think makes sense why I would call myself that. And then the subtitle is Lambs in the Laundry Room and Other Stories from Perkins County. And so when this book was born out of the fact that when I decided that this was going to be a permanent lifestyle change, I knew I had to have a creative outlet. And since traveling and performing the way I had been wasn't going to be an option, I started writing a weekly column for our town paper. And what I didn't expect is that the that it was going to be as well received as it was, and that it would sort of gain popularity to the point where I started having other papers contact me, and eventually I think now it's carried by 12 different papers, and ended up getting to work for South Dakota Magazine and then South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And I just, looking back at that trajectory, I think it's because people are just hungry for these stories of the land and this landscape. I mean, the prairie narrative is a really big part of American culture. And a lot of the way that it's presented is with kind of a nostalgia of of this imagined past. And I think both for people living in urban places like myself, I mean, that narrative really called to me even as a child. And I'm going to read you a chapter about that in just a minute. But for even people living in rural areas, I think that hearing these stories told from a modern perspective has been, like I said, well received, because I think that there is something about that connection to the land and landscape that is really important and powerful, and really and almost necessary, I guess I'd say. So I'm going to real quick read a chapter from the book, because it gives, again, a little more background, and also it tickles me, because I'm going to talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder's book Little House in the Big Woods, which I just got done reading to my kids, and so that's been a fun full circle event. But this was actually written before my kids were born. So this was when I think the second spring I'd lived in South Dakota. So it's called Daydreams. When I was a kid, my suburban backyard was a green square bordered by a chain link fence. It featured a rock garden with jack-in-the-pulpits, forget-me-nots, bleeding hearts, and a yucca plant standing sentinel over whatever annuals happened to catch my mother's fancy that year. Beside the house, in the shaded sliver before the next yard started, grew the perfume-blossomed lilies of the valley in a thickly leafed blanket. I remember these things vividly because it was the 80s, before the internet, and before most people had air conditioning, when kids spent sunny summer days almost exclusively outdoors. My siblings spent those hours playing roving games of kick the can and hide and seek with other kids in the neighborhood. But I was awkward and sensitive, alternating between too old and too young for my age. Consequently, instead of playing, I spent a lot of time squatting over the flower beds, envisioning whole worlds held in the stems and blossoms and pebbles. I also spent a lot of time reading books, especially when I got older, imagining the life I'd have when I grew up. One of my most vivid summer memories is of reading Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. It was late July, and I was in our damp, unfinished basement waiting for a summer storm to pass, completely enraptured by the descriptions of the Ingalls family's preparation for the impending winter. The jewel-bright colors of the jams and tomato pickles, the squealing of the butchered pig, the rich, salty scent of sizzling sausage were as vivid to me as anything I'd ever seen or heard or smelled in my own life. Eventually, I read all the Little House books, but I returned to that first book many times, rereading it with the same pleasure. To this day, I'm not sure if I've ever enjoyed reading anything more. But did I ever imagine that pioneer life as my own? No. It was too impossibly far from that narrow square of suburban lawn. Almost 2 years into this grand adventure, I still regularly look out the kitchen window in disbelief at the tinned peak of our old barn, or the chickens rambling around the yard, or the motley band of sheep, cows, horses, and donkeys that dot the emerald horizon. It is so far from anything my child self recognizes as familiar. And I've now finally lived in one place long enough to plant a rock garden of my own. Like my mother's, mine has bleeding hearts and forget-me-nots, as well as rambling pink and red roses, lilies, and coral bells. All summer I tended it, and the result now, in the last of the heat, is a profusion of blossoms amongst the stones. The vegetable garden is also in its zenith, and it won't be long before I start canning, so we can have tomatoes and beans and spicy cucumber pickles for the winter. They will line the shelves next to the freezer that holds the broilers we butchered last weekend. There will be sausage too, and dried herbs, and a root cellar with pumpkins and potatoes and a few apples if we're lucky. I don't know how many people get to live their childhood fantasies. It is a luxury and one of the blessings of this prairie life. There is so much in the world to fall in love with if you let yourself, and I've decided to let myself. So, all right, I better check the time and make sure I'm not going to talk too long because we want to have plenty of time for questions. So like I said, I mean, it's funny to revisit that piece of writing now, having just reread that very book with my kids, because the things that I talk about in that essay and have now lived are what they are growing up knowing. So for them, they love the book, Little House in the Big Woods. They've been really enjoying it, but they're enjoying it because it's familiar. And that it just kind of blows my mind. Like I still sort of can't believe it. It's pretty cool. But part of what I wanted to talk about, and when we open up for questions, you feel welcome to ask me about anything about the book. So if you've read it and you want to ask about a different topic or a different part, we definitely can. But for the purposes of this talk, one of the things I wanted to talk about was sort of reimagining that homesteader narrative, and also as we're bringing it into this time, how our perspective has changed. So one of the source materials that I was working with in designing this program was The Land of the Burnt Thigh. So I don't know how many of you guys have read that, but it's a really amazing memoir written by a woman who kind of reminds me of myself, but did this 100 years ago, and was as ill prepared as I was to confront prairie life and life on the plains. But the difference was, she was doing it when the land was just being opened up for homesteaders. So she did not get to have Zoom meetings. And nor did she have a husband who was much more capable than she was. So it's a great book. I highly recommend. But one of the things that's very interesting about it is that, and it is similar to me in a way to the Little House books, is the idea that somehow we need to conquer the wilderness, and that was very, very much like of the time, that this idea that manifest destiny, we had to move into these wildernesses and conquer them, and that we needed to, that somehow through our hard work and effort, we were going to overcome sort of the obstacles of the natural world, and maybe even of our own human bodies, and that was the promise that we were being offered by progress. And I was going to read you just a little bit about, or not a little bit about, but I was going to read you one line from Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little Town on the Prairie. So this is a quote from her mom. She says, "The prairie looks so beautiful and gentle," she said, "but I wonder what it will do next. Sometimes it seems like we have to fight it all the time." This is Laura speaking. And then her mom says, "This earthly life is a battle," said Ma. "If it isn't one thing to contend with, it's another. It always has been so, and it always will be. The sooner you make up your mind to that, the better off you are, and the more thankful for your pleasures." And I think that really epitomizes that the mentality that people often had about the plains, and maybe still do, to the extent that it is a difficult place to live, and to farm and to ranch, because there's a lot of extremes with weather. We're right now, we were just talking about having great weather, but embedded in the great weather is the fear of drought, because it has barely snowed at all, and it's so warm we're already looking at the grass, and everybody's already starting, around here is starting to make plans for what they'll sell of their livestock if it doesn't start raining or start snowing soon, because we just won't have the grass to feed things. So it is a life that has hardships involved. But I wanted to read you something really quick from Linda Hazelstrom, who is another great South Dakota writer and rancher, although she is a modern writer. And this is actually from her book, Gathering the Grasslands, a Plains Journal. And this just came out, I think it might be 2018. So this is from May 31st. So it's organized as a journal, which again, if you haven't read it, it's a wonderful book. But so this is from March 31st. A heron stands in the pond, looking like a Chinese painting through the fog. I love seeing them fly because they carry their necks in an S shape and trail their legs. We often see two great blues standing on opposite sides of Lake Linda hour after hour, patiently waiting for the perfect strike. When the great beak descends and then flashes backward, we know the bird is swallowing prey, usually a frog or small turtle, though it may also eat snakes, insects, and smaller birds. Sometimes we sit quietly on the deck, watching the darkness flow over the prairie until the herons are completely invisible to us. Yet even in the dark, the birds continue to stand, hunting, because their eyes allow them to see so well. Even in darkness, the small prey is not safe from the mighty yellowbill. I started reading about, and this, I don't know how to pronounce this word, she's talking about a type of meditation, vipassana meditation, about gurus and yoga, but stopped when I realized that the prairie is both my path to enlightenment and enlightenment itself. The prairie is suitably immense in age and serenity. Its silence and depth provide a meditation room for anyone who pays attention. Sit in silence and open yourself, say the gurus, and you will see God or goddess in whatever manifestation most appeals to you. Around me, I see nothing that is not holy. Goddess in the grass, the birds, the clouds, antelope, muddy pond. Goddess in the sunlight. So the reason I wanted to read those two things next to each other, and also in the context of my own book, is because I think it's really, that's a pretty stark contrast in the way that the prairie is being envisioned. And I think Linda would not disagree that it can be a harsh place. And unlike me, she grew up here and has been ranching, for her whole life, so knows plenty more about the hardship than even I do, and yet is able to describe this as a place of serenity. and I think, again, as we move forward into the uncertain future, and I wonder how it changes things. And so I guess basically the thesis statement for this program is really a question to you as readers and as members of humanity, is how do things change if we see ourselves in relationship with our landscapes, and the landscapes and the land itself having the potential to heal us, rather than something we're in kind of combat with or something we have to tame. I work in agriculture, so I don't see the answer as returning to wildness entirely. People still need to eat, but I wonder how agriculture, with an emphasis in the culture, changes when we change the way we see the connection we have with the places that we live. So with that, I'm just right about on time for the speaking portion. And so yeah, I just want to open up to questions. Like I said, feel free to ask about anything in the book that you'd like. I'm more than happy to answer it, but I would also love to hear your thoughts on that topic about our place and our context in the family of things, to quote Mary Oliver.
And most of you are on mute, so if you have a question or a comment, please take yourself off of mute. If you don't know how, then raise your hand and I'll see if I can help you.
Oh, it looks like, we can't hear you, Barbara. Oh
I
no.
think I'm okay, right?
Oh, good.
Yep.
All right. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that my perspective is, I think, different. Things have changed so much since the time I lived there as a child. And this is northeastern South Dakota, right at the, they sort of say the fringe of the prairie. And so when I returned in 2019, I was devastated. I had already had the experience as a younger woman when I went back to the farm I grew up on, and it had been purchased by someone else. My parents had lived there for 50 years. And I wasn't prepared because the hills were part of my childhood. Whether having to climb up them, on the way to school, or having fun sliding down them, or not being able to get the car up because it was too icy. But the hills were really part of our home place. And the cottonwood tree, which was sort of central to our, well, it was a landmark for us children. And so when I returned, and in the meantime, our barn had burned right before I'd left for a long time. So that I still had in my mind, which that shouldn't have been a shock, but it was a shock. But anyway, they had literally lowered the hill. So I thought that was the most I could sort of be hurt by a change in the landscape. But when I went back in the fall of 2019, I couldn't even locate the farm. The house had been moved and a new house built. That was all fine. But literally, my brother and I were trying to find where we had done this and this. Everything was gone. It was widened. It was wiped out. Hills, more hills were lowered. And then as we drove farther into Ortonville, I grew up near Big Stone City, into Ortonville, across the state line. It just got worse and worse, and I was devastated. So that's my view of progress. Leveling out the fields made it easier, obviously, to farm. But yeah, it took emotional toll, and I've sort of written about it since, and that's helped heal it. But the people, even say the younger generation, they aren't even aware of the changes. It has to take someone, I guess, 65 and above, who can talk about it. Otherwise, it's just the way it's always been,
Mhm.
for them. And that's how life goes. But anyway, that's my perspective on progress, so to speak.
Yeah. Progress in quotes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting growing up, not in a place that was, a suburb. It was all houses and buildings.
Mhm.
And so I've had the same experience because so it's actually really awful to hear that happened to you too, because somehow in my mind, still romanticizing sort of rural life, it's like, oh, but then how you can't change the land, whereas where I grew up, it was like people redecorate, you just the street I live on looks completely different than when I lived there, or what my childhood home, because people have torn stuff down, added additions, built new houses, so it's like, of course it looks different, but to actually see hills gone, that does sound awful. And oh yeah, because there's some things you want to believe are timeless, and hills
Well,
are.
that's it. Yeah, you think they're there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, Lake's gone also, because when we drove in the Minnesota side, an area we knew well because it's so close to where our farm was. But again, we were trying to find this old cemetery that my brother had gone to during his when he was a teenager. And we knew we would have heard if they would have moved the cemetery or plowed it under or whatever they might have done. And so we said, okay, when we were driving, and now those narrow country roads were these huge things. So these big trucks, these earth moving machines could go back and forth in the big trailer trucks. And And my brother kept saying, well, when I find that lake, he said, I find that lake, then I'll know where to turn and which way to go. The lake is gone.
Wow.
Yeah. So even he's much less sentimental than I am, but that hit him hard. He said, that's where I always went duck hunting. It's gone. We used to fish there. It's gone, you know. Anyway, and it wasn't a pond. This was a lake.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, that's enough said about that. But yeah. And of course, some people just don't care. I mean, they don't care about what they're looking toward or out toward, right?
Mhm.
Mhm. So talk about it, and their eyes would sort of roll, and they, you know, change sports or something. Anyway, that's, I don't know if anybody else has had experiences like that. You.
Well, so how many, so I guess I don't know for the other people. So Barbara is from South Dakota, obviously, but doesn't live here now. How many of the rest of you are in South Dakota, right? Like, or live in South Dakota? And so we've got some that we don't see pictures, but hello. So, and how many of you are from South Dakota? So it looks like most of you are here actually physically in South Dakota, and how many are from South Dakota? So only 2. And then, and if for those of you that we can't see, if you want it, you could feel free to just jump on. You can just say me or I'm from here if you want to. So, because I do think it's really, I mean, the first time I ever came to South Dakota actually was on tour, and people that, so one of the things about touring is the interesting thing, you just get to find out all these different sort of like regional quirks, and that different places, there's always like a first question. And like in Minnesota, it's often about the weather. And South Dakotans like to talk about weather too, but not as much as Minnesotans. And the thing about South Dakotans, the first question they would always want to know was they wanted to know about my last name, because they wanted to know if they knew anybody or if like we could somehow be related. And so Blue is not my real last name. It's not my married name, and it was never my real name. It was sort of a joke that turned unfortunately into a permanent situation. But my real last name or maiden name was Benacci. And so when I'd pull that one out, everyone would just be like, oh yeah, no. Because and I didn't understand it at first. I was like, why are you asking why do you want to know that? And then I realized it was like, oh, because they want to find out if there's a way our families could be connected, because in South Dakota that is so much more common that you could discover your like long lost kin by asking those questions, which I still think is so cool. And that was something also when I first was teaching here, we did a unit early on with one of my classes. We did a unit on writing narratives. And so I thought it would be fun if they took a relative and wrote a historical narrative of a relative. And I was shocked to discover that every single person in that class had at least one grandparent or great grandparent that was an original homesteader. And in some cases, all of their relatives had been here since it had been opened up for homesteading. And that's just very unusual anywhere else in the country. That's to have people be able to trace their relatives back a couple generations. I mean, and to have a whole classroom of kids be able to do that is not normal, I think, because we have become so transient. So socially, I guess I should say. So we've just had some new people join us, it looks like. We are talking about, well, my book for one thing, but we're also talking about sort of homesteader narratives in general. And I had opened it. So for those of you that just got here, I had sort of opened it up for questions. So if you've read my book, Accidental Rancher, and you have a question about my book, please feel free to ask it. But I'd read a few quotes from Little House on the Prairie and from Gathering the Grasslands, just talking about it, and I just used two very short things to kind of set the scene of how when we originally opened this land up for homesteading, there was a mentality with a lot of the people coming in that the landscape was something that needed to be conquered. And the other thing, I didn't mention this at the beginning, that they talked about that in the land of the burnt thigh, but also was just sort of like the common way of thinking about agriculture at that point, or the common wisdom was this idea that rain would follow the plow. And there was actually sort of this kind of pseudoscience around the idea that if you opened up if you plowed up the land, that like moisture from the land would actually like sort of rise, and that would like attract clouds, and so you'd get more rain. So the idea, especially West River, which is where I live, that somehow agriculture, the way they were doing it at that point, which was to plow things up, that would lead to more moisture, which unfortunately, was not the case. Very much not the case. And similarly, again, in the land of the burnt thigh, she talks specifically about how, it became common practice to plow multiple times in a year, because then the idea was that like then you're opening the ground up, that like the topsoil or the outer layer of grass and the thick roots were part of what was causing it to be dry. And if you got rid of that, and then the soil was exposed, then it would be able to soak the moisture in better. So when it did rain, it would actually hold the moisture more. So which, again, as we now know, that the exact opposite is true, which is that the roots actually prevent erosion and help retain moisture. So anyway, the question I had sort of presented for you, and again, like I said, ask questions about anything, but if anyone has particularly thoughts about sort of how our relationship with the landscape has evolved or is evolving, or maybe even needs to evolve as we are going forward, how we can change our mentality, or, again, so Barbara is just telling us a story of like plowing, leveling hillsides, and the conquering the landscape. I feel like the point you were trying to make is like we're definitely still in the conquer the landscape mode. Leveling a hillside definitely sounds like trying to conquer, and filling in a lake sounds like trying to conquer the landscape. So anyway, but if anyone else has any other thoughts or questions they'd like to add, I'd love to hear them.
May I comment quickly? It's kind of a windstorm where I'm at. If I disconnect, I don't want to be a distraction. I may not try to get back in. But a couple of things, because I missed part of your discussion then because I was disconnected. One is thinking of land as a commodity, and a political comment. I'm disturbed by foreign ownership of some of our ranches in Montana and so on, because I don't know that the owners have a relationship with the land other than as an object to make money off of. And so they don't have that other side that farmers and ranchers, that live with the land have. So that's one thought. And then I wanted to make a boundary in terms of relationships and history with the land, and that's electricity, the difference between when you have electricity and when you don't. But I think I disagree with that, because I think you can have the aesthetic, emotional side with the land, whether you have electricity or not. It doesn't have to change that, but that's just my thought.
That is really interesting point, though, because I've thought of that a lot, about how that was such a huge change when you didn't have to go, like when it did, like it gets, well, right now it's dark, but like here we are all like hanging out. Like if it was dark and there was no electricity, like we'd go to bed. Or hang out for a little bit by the lamplight and then go to bed. And I think that all the time, just like, geez, I get so much better sleep if we didn't have electricity. So I think that I actually do, I believe it or not, think about that a lot. Like that, I don't know. Sometimes I think about having days where like, what if we just tried not using electricity, just to see how that would change I mean, it would change everything, and maybe that would be cool. Except refrigeration. I don't think we'd unplug that for for a day. Um, any other thoughts or questions?
Eliza, this is Catherine, and I'm just going to go back to your book. Of the essays in your book, you read one. Do you have a favorite? And if so, why?
Oh, that is a good question. Do I have a favorite? I think the first one might be, if it's not my favorite, it's one of my favorites, and that's why it's first. And the last one is probably one of my other favorites, which is why it's last, because I wanted to end on a strong note. The first essay is called "The Oldest Chicken in the County," and it was, I think one of the reasons it's my favorite is because, well, I just like the story. I mean, when it was happening in real life, it was pretty awesome, because basically we had a chicken that was lost it was this very, very old, very decrepit chicken. And for those of you that haven't read it, I'm going to do a spoiler alert here, but it went missing, and, I just assumed it had died somewhere, because it had been like, I mean, really on its last legs for like a full year. And so it was missing for like 2 weeks. And then I heard, and I just kept thinking, like, I just felt like it's weird that I haven't found her. And, I mean, sadly on a ranch, like, things go missing, something finds an old chicken and drags it away. That's not unusual. So, but I just kept thinking, it's just weird. We never saw her. And again, and then one day I was in the barn and I heard this like far off chicken sound, just like this little soft, like, whoop, 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 whoop. I was like, oh. And her name, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm going to forget her name. Mike. Her name was Mike because my husband named her, which is part of the humor of the story. Anyway, she had somehow flown up, like up to the rafters, and then fallen into the space between the outer wall and the inner wall. And she had been trapped in the space this big for 2 weeks without food or water, and somehow was still alive. And so I fished her out, and which was sort of another humorous part of the story. But it was like a miracle. It was like a chicken miracle. And I'd written, when I wrote that piece, it was happened to be right around the time of year when I had played, I think it was 4 years previous, I had played the Minnesota State Fair, and I had just released this big album, and I was, I'd gotten pretty good reviews, and was, career-wise, my career was going very well as a musician. But I felt like I was, instead of being sort of at the height of things, I was just in like at the low point where I knew I had to make a change. I knew I couldn't keep doing things the way I'd been doing them, and traveling all the time and being on the road all the time. And so I'd played this big show at the Minnesota State Fair, which if you are from Minnesota, or if you've been there, it's huge. It's like the biggest event of the year in Minnesota. And here were these throngs of people, and it was just, should have been so exciting. But after I was done, I went to the poultry barn and just like found like that somehow was like speaking to my soul in a way that playing for 1,000 people did not. And I was like, I don't understand this, but like, I just want to hang out in the poultry barn. And so when I made the realization that however many years had passed, and it was like, I went from playing on this big stage in front of all these people to like fishing a chicken out of the wall of the barn. And like, that felt like this just amazing miracle and awesome experience. And it's just one of those funny moments where it's like this, you just never know what path life is going to take you. And you never know, I guess, until you arrive where it is you're heading. But for me, that moment was that sort of like exhale of like, yes, I've, the crazy curves have led me here, and this is definitely where I'm meant to be. So yeah, I would say that's one of my favorites. Any other questions?
So I love the way you talked about needing this creative outlet when you moved and that you fell into writing. Do you think that that has worked? Do you feel the itch to do music? I imagine you sing a lot around the house, but
Well,
if
yeah, it's interesting. It kind of ebbs and flows. You know, when I first like decided I was going to stay, I really thought, I was like, well, that's it. I just have to say, you know, like music is just something I'll just sing around the house basically, or at church, or, you know, like stuff that's more community oriented. And I was kind of fine with that. But then it ended up feeling too sad. Like a few years in, I just was like, it did sort of feel a little bit like I chopped off my arm and I missed my arm. So, so I started looking for ways to play again. And, you know, for another just crazy story, the bass player for Neil Young's band, Crazy Horse, he lives about 40 miles from here. And so I had heard rumors that he lived around here. And then we ended up meeting up at a mutual friend's barbecue, and he, is amazing, so cool. And so he asked me, you know, people introduced me as a musician, and so he asked me to come to his place and kind of jam, and we did. And then he ended up asking me to record on 2 solo albums he did, and then I asked him if he would help me record a new album. So 2 years ago, I did put out another album, and in the interim, I had these 2 kids, and which also you'd think would mean it would make it harder to travel, but I did end up when they were small doing quite a bit of touring in the summers. And now I'm actually doing a TV show with SDPB that's a traveling concert series. So I still do get to play a lot of music. We're actually gearing up to record another album of music from that show. So yeah, I got to have my cake and eat it too. But I feel like, you know, I had to journey through the darkness of giving that up, and because I couldn't imagine how I could make both work and live here. And it turned out I could, but for a while it seemed impossible. But that's the thing. I believe that life has a way, if you let it, you know, of things sort of working out when they need to and how they need to. At least, I mean, yeah, I guess that's a little bit turning it into a cliche that makes it sound much, much easier than it actually is. But any other questions? It looks like, oh, Helen, are you trying to ask? Oh, Helen's trying to ask a question.
Okay, this is Helen. Yes. One, I like, you know, your perspective of trying to live in harmony with the land instead of trying to conquer it. And when Barbara was talking about her experience going back to Northeast South Dakota, I remember going to a meeting someplace, and they were talking about how draining all the farmland has eliminated the ponds that ducks need to have to land and to fly across our land and stuff like that. And we just went west for the first time since last summer, and all the dirt that had blown off a field west of Fort Pierre was just sad to see that. And I know there's a lot of farmers that are very careful about taking care of the land and having waterways and stuff, but whatever happened there, maybe just the dry weather and the wheat didn't sprout or something, I don't know. But then I want to ask a little nitty gritty question of you, because I've had some experience with lambs, and it's fun to feed them. So can you give them shots and dock them and castrate them, or does your husband do that?
We band, so he, like, I hold him and he, you know, uses the bander, which is a little bit less intense, I guess. The first year he did it, we actually had a friend come in and did it, you know, the old fashioned way. And I was like, I don't think I can do this again. Yeah. So we banned them now. And I have tried to give shots, and I I'm just such a baby about it. I'm just like, so I've done it, but like I do it badly, and there's like a lot of drama.
Okay.
You know, like get all swoony. So most of the time he definitely bears the brunt of the harder jobs. And you know, when it comes to like pulling lambs, you know, during lambing, it's funny because we kind of have a joke that I am better at that because my hands are very small, but it's, you know, I usually still need him to hold the ewe or whatever. And so I've pulled my share of lambs, but yeah, he definitely, I mean, I feel like if I had to do it on my own, that would be really, really hard.
Okay.
In fact, we have a breed of sheep that we keep now, just a handful, but like, because I was like, we're gonna start raising Shetland sheep because they're a primitive breed because you don't have to dock their tails. And I was like, I just hate docking every year. It makes me so upset. And so we got these little Shetland sheep, and I adore them. They're very, very cool and cute and all that stuff, but they are terrible fence crawlers. So that didn't last. We went back to range sheep because he's like, yeah, no. Maybe, and I mean, they're really the Shetland sheep. They are meant to be in the British Isles. You can tell because when we lost a lot to coyotes the first year because when like our guard dog does a great job. She's like on it, but where, you know, a Targhee or Rambouillet will bunch if they sense danger, these Shetlands would scatter and they just like spread out. And so our guard dog just couldn't keep them. And I don't know if the coyotes would like hunt in bands, so they'd like just, you know, she couldn't keep them safe, basically is what I'm trying to say. So so that didn't work out. That was pretty sad. It was like all to save myself docking tails.
Okay. Thank you.
You remind
Eliza,
me
this
when
is-
my
Go
grandparents.
ahead, Lynn.
Go ahead. Well, you remind me when my grandpa would bring in lambs and put them next to the wood stove in a box. He'd heat bricks and then wrap blankets around that and put the lambs in the box next to the wood stove. That makes me sound like I'm as old as I am, but I mean, I was a kid when I saw that. But that's
Well, we have a propane stove, so and we do the same exact thing. I bring them in when we've tried lambing. The past 2 years we've done it in May because at first we were doing it in April and we just kept having terrible snowstorms that would hit like right when we started lambing. And so maybe it was 2 years. I can't remember when it was, but we had a terrible storm. That was the last time we lambed in April because I lost so many because it was just so cold. I couldn't bring them in fast enough. And they were in a barn, but it was like, you know, 2 degrees and you just can't. I mean, they couldn't, the ewes couldn't come in the house and I just couldn't get out there fast enough to get them in. But by the time, you know, if they were out for any amount of time, they just get chilled down. So by the wood stove is a good way to do it, is what I'm trying to say. There's no modern thing that's better than that, except I guess having a lambing barn that's like heated. You were gonna say something, Catherine? Did you have a?
I was just curious, whenever you go back to Minnesota to visit family, then do you come back and write your weekly article about the differences in the city life and the ranch life?
Yeah, I have actually. And the other thing I write about, my poor mom, she started getting, so our town paper is, we live outside of Bison, so our town paper is the Bison Courier, and she started getting the Bison Courier so she could read my columns, which meant I had to change a little bit what I wrote about, because a lot of times they were about her coming to visit and just being like, woo. I just wrote one last week actually that she called me up and she was laughing because I was talking about how when she and my sister come out to visit, you know, I'm used to the amount of manure that is just part of ranch life, but they are not. And whenever they come out, you know, now that I've been here for long enough that it's like I don't even see that that's what we're walking through. I don't even notice. And they'll be like, you know, like, trying not to make a big deal, but just like, you could tell like, but, and they, you know, they're like scared of germs. And I'm like, I don't think that there is actually germs in the cow poop. Otherwise we'd all be dead because we're just like covered in it all the time. Or maybe we've inoculated ourselves. I don't know. But there's just, I mean, with the amount of cow poop you encounter, it can't be that harmful.
Eliza, one of my favorite stories in the book, and I'm going to hold up a copy, yes, and pitch that we have it available in our stores here at the Cultural Heritage Center in Capitol, was about how the man of the ranch brought you 2 miniature donkeys. Yes, could you tell about that? And are the donkeys still alive?
Well, one of them actually passed away last spring, so it's been just about a year, and it was so sad. Oh yeah, I mean, when he got them, we had no idea. Like, it was, so he works at a sale barn. Like every rancher, he has millions of jobs in addition to ranching. So one of his jobs is to work at the sale barn, and they had come through the sale barn right before we were about to get married. And so I mean, they're adorable. If you've ever seen Shrek, you know what that donkey in Shrek looks like, with that giant head and then like a tiny body. It was clearly, the illustrator clearly was thinking of a miniature donkey, because that's exactly how they look. Their heads are almost normal donkey size, and then they've got like these big, cute, chubby bellies, and then these little skinny stick legs. So anyways, he just saw them and they were, hilarious and adorable. So he just bought them and brought them home as a wedding present, which was pretty amazing. But yeah, and I actually wrote another story about them. It wasn't in the book, but they were just the best of friends, totally inseparable. And then we had a neighbor who he was an older gentleman, and he was going away for the winter. He was going to Arizona. And he had this donkey that was like sort of a friend of his horse and kind of a pet. And so he was like, can she come stay at your place for the winter? I don't want to leave her alone. So he brought her name was Miss Peppy. And so he brought Miss Peppy, and those two, and she was a full-size donkey. And those 2 miniature donkeys, they became the bitterest of enemies, like within minutes. And they were so in love with her. And the whole winter, they just fought. They would yell at each other. They would try to kick each other. It was horrible. And meanwhile, she was like, like a full-size donkey. It was just like, what even are you? She had no interest in them whatsoever. So they were like constantly fighting it over. She wanted nothing to do with them. So when she left, they went back to being friends. But I feel like it was never quite the same after that. So, and now we've talked about trying, should we get another donkey for so Wilbur was the one that died. We still have Orville, and it was like, should we get another donkey for him? And we just don't know. We're not quite sure what to do. He's sort of an odd duck, and so he hangs out with the sheep, and he seems to be okay with it. But yeah, it was pretty sad. Anybody else?
It's almost 8 o'clock. So is there any other questions for Eliza? Dorinda, do you want to share information about the book club?
Yes, I will. And I will say Eliza mentioned this, but I believe the program on public TV is next Thursday night.
Well, they actually, ordinarily it would be, but because March is pledge drive month, they don't usually do new programming. So it will start back up though, and there'll be a new episode in April and an episode in May, and they appear on Thursdays after Dakota Life. And then we'll be off for the summer, but we're going to be filming new episodes, so it'll start again in September. But they are online. So we've had 2 episodes air already, and I think you can find them on SDPBs in their archives, I believe.
Great. Okay, so our next program will be on a Thursday night, April 15th, also at 7 o'clock. We'll try Zooming again. And we'll be sending out an email with more information and a link to it too. So we hope, oh, I'd better tell about the program itself. It's Betsy De La Roche, who used to live in Pierre and will be our presenter. And she has written 3 volumes about country schools, past and present. Like Eliza, she was, well, raised in cities in the East, and she had no idea what a country school even was until she moved to South Dakota. Well, and she even had to ask her husband, where is South Dakota? But when she got here, she's an artist, and she had done a drawing of a country school and entered it in a local art show. And people kept stopping by and sharing stories of country schools with her and how they'd gone or their parents or they taught. And so she decided to collect memories from teachers and students of what they remembered about going to a country school. And now she has 3 volumes out of people sharing their memories. So she'll tell about the history of country schools and have a PowerPoint about it and talk about her books. And people who attended country schools are especially welcome to join and share their memories. And this program, well, and Eliza and this program are also made possible by a grant from the South Dakota Humanities Council. So we thank them for doing that. And this time I promise I will not send 3 emails about the same thing to people. I will try not to.
Real quick before we go, maybe you said it and I didn't catch it. What's the name of the show on public broadcasting?
Oh, it's called, you know what, I don't think I did. It's called Wish You Were Here. Because we sort of, it came out of not being able to do live shows during the pandemic. And so we thought we'd go to locations and we'd film it. So basically the idea was we were gonna kind of film it as if it were a concert that, you know, you were coming to, but doing it in locations that people might not otherwise know about. Or would, you know, so part of it is highlighting the place. And then part of it was sort of doing some music that was thematically related to the place. So the first 2 that have aired, one was at the Hoover store, which is the oldest operating general store in South Dakota, but maybe, I'm not sure, like maybe like in the Dakotas in general. It's been around for quite a while. And then the next one was at the Slim Buttes, which is a really cool geological formation that's right pretty much directly west of where I live and almost on the border. And then the next one we're doing is going to be the one that will come out in April is at John Lopez's studio in Lemon. And the last one is the Stone Church that is on the Standing Rock Reservation, which if you've never, I mean, I'd never been there. It's very, very hard to find actually, but it's really stunning. It's this, it's built out of limestone that was quarried or sandstone that was quarried from the Firesteel Creek, which is sort of the backdrop for the church. It's pretty amazing. So, and then for next year, we're really excited actually, because we're trying to sort of broaden it and bring on more artists and musicians and kind of do a little bit more of highlighting the arts in South Dakota in general, but also we're really trying to focus on rural arts and artists and sort of talking more about how, you know, the wealth of the arts about the landscape here, and also again, you know, back to agriculture, like thinking about the culture of agriculture and thinking about the work that's being done around that in our state. So yeah, we're excited to see where it goes.
Well, thank you all for attending tonight, and we hope to see you all back in April. And thank you very much, Eliza, for being our guest speaker tonight, and Catherine, you for being the moderator, and to all who joined. So stay warm during our impending snowstorm, if we get any, and spring us on the way.
Thank you for a wonderful program.
Yes, well, thank you all. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Eliza.
Bye now.
Bye all.